On this episode of WarDocs, retired Army Colonel and current COO of the Veterans Health Administration, Dr. Stephen Braverman shares his journey into military medicine, detailing his motivation for choosing his path and his experiences in physical medicine and rehabilitation. He discusses the critical role of PM&R in the military, particularly in maintaining soldiers' readiness and addressing musculoskeletal issues. Dr. Braverman reflects on his deployments, leadership lessons learned, and the importance of crisis management, particularly during the Ebola vaccine trials and the 2009 Fort Hood shooting incident. Dr. Braverman reflects on his transition to leadership in federal medicine, emphasizing the importance of leadership and the mission to care for veterans. He also highlights the importance of partnerships in American healthcare and shares his vision for the future of the Veterans Health Administration, encouraging young professionals to pursue careers in military and federal medicine. For further information about Dr. Braverman and our previous guests, please visit our website at wardocspodcast.com. Be sure to follow WarDocs on your preferred podcast platform and subscribe to our WarDocs YouTube channel. I'm your host, Dr. Doug Soderdahl, retired Army urologist.
Welcome to WarDocs, the military medicine podcast. This show brings you a first-hand, behind-the-scenes look into the mission, unique opportunities, and deployed experiences of the entire military healthcare team. From state-of-the-art hospitals in the United States to the most austere environments across the globe, WarDocs has you covered.
Today, we're privileged to welcome retired Army Colonel and current Chief Operating Officer at the Veterans Health Administration, Dr. Stephen E. Braverman to WarDocs. Steve, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with your kind of initial story into military medicine. What drew you to pursue a career in military medicine, and how did you select your specialty?
So what's interesting is that when I was in college, I was trying to decide, hey, I was pre-med and pre-law, and what did I want to do? And it became clear after a couple of those pre-law courses that medicine was the way I was going. And then I was at University of Virginia, and I decided that I wanted to find a way to pay for medical school myself, so my parents didn't have to do that. And the way to do that for me was to potentially pursue that HPSB scholarship through the Army. And what's funny is that I got a letter telling me I got the HPSB scholarship the same day I got the letter of my acceptance to Vanderbilt for medical school. And the letter from the HPSB recruiter basically said, hey, congratulations on getting into Vanderbilt. We'd like to offer you a scholarship. And had I opened the Army letter before the Vanderbilt letter, that's how I would have found out I gotten into medical school at Vanderbilt. But once there, Vandy didn't have anything associated with physical medicine there for the medical school. It wasn't a very popular specialty at the time. But I had an aunt in Baltimore where I grew up who was a physical therapist, and another great aunt, also in Baltimore, who lived next to a physiatrist, the other name for physical medicine and rehab physicians. And they both knew of my interest in sports medicine, the fact that I wasn't going to be suited to be a surgeon of any type, and suggested that PM&R would be a good specialty for me. And in fact, it turned out to be a wonderful specialty for me. When I was doing my transitional internship at Eisenhower Army Medical Center in Augusta, we didn't have any PM&R rotations, but the last rotation I had was oncology. And it turned out that ended up being the favorite rotation that I had during my transitional year. And I was trying to be, or I guess I was getting recruited by that team to potentially switch over to medicine and oncology. And there was an interest there. Of course, that PM&R is still what my love was. And folks sometimes wonder, well, what's the connection, say, between oncology and PM&R? And it sounds like it doesn't make sense when you're taking care of people who might die versus others. But in all of those situations, you're really dealing with the functioning of the individual and trying to maximize that function along the way. Now in PM&R, I took an interest in academia. I spent my first 12 years at Walter Reed, being part of the residency program and eventually the residency director and service chief. But my love was musculoskeletal and pain medicine as part of that. So that set up kind of the rest of the career in the Army because it wasn't just about patient care, but it was an opportunity to do something different every day, whether that was academics, whether as a chief it was administration. I could take care of patients. I learned how to do acupuncture, had my own clinics, and there was great variety every day. And being in charge of things along the way at a much younger, sooner experiential level in the Army than would have happened in the private sector. So my initial part of being in the Army was awesome at Walter Reed.
So for those who may not know much about PM&R, what does a PM&R physician do? And secondly, what do they do in the military? And thirdly, is there any role for PM&R in a deployed environment?
So physical medicine and rehab is kind of what it sounds like. That many people kind of divide it into two categories. So one is musculoskeletal medicine, think non-operative sports medicine kind of stuff. So in an Army environment, that's what people need. I mean, how much of Army medicine is really taking care of people with musculoskeletal problems and musculoskeletal concerns? The second piece is the medical piece and the rehabilitation, which is all about getting people who are injured or ill with neuromuscular diseases, say stroke, spinal cord injury, brain injury, amputations, and muscular dystrophy, which we don't see too much of in the Army per se, but being able to provide rehabilitation services to them, putting together the rehab program that might include physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech and language pathology, and building a program to maximize the capability and function of all of the patients that you're taking care of along the way. And when you think of a soldier as an athlete, all of the care that we're providing for that soldier is for him or her to be ready to serve and do the things that they need to do for the parts of their job that are important. And PM&R fits right into that care of the soldier along the way. When you think about deployment, there's kind of two different ways in which that fits in. One is the medicine part, which is really part and parcel of, in some cases, being a first level primary care provider, and it really lends itself to being a battalion surgeon, a brigade surgeon. In my case, a surgeon for the Corps when I deployed, and being able to take care of the initial needs of those soldiers, but then also the musculoskeletal issues that come with carrying heavy packs, doing all of the physical requirements, that happen during a deployment. So it really lends itself well to the deployment medicine part. Now, PM&R is not a large specialty in the military because very often people think of it as, well, rehab should be in the VA. But from a standpoint of keeping people ready to do the physical demands that they have associated with either peacetime or wartime mission, it really is a good specialty to assist in the care of our soldiers.
So from your deployments, were there any key events or key lessons that you learned? Because later on, you went to be in senior leadership in Army medicine. And so you were involved in medical readiness. What did you learn from those deployments that helped you further along in your career?
Actually, in this case, I'd say it's sort of the opposite. I'd say my career helped me ready for the deployment because the deployment that I did was already at the senior level. So I had spent a lot of time at Walter Reed, as I mentioned. I was there until 2000. Then I started on my career with operational and administrative medicine. So I went from Walter Reed to be a deputy commander at Fort Jackson. Then I was at National War College for a couple of years, followed that up with a command tour at Fort Knox's hospital. And so by then, we're into 2007, and I was a colonel now for 3 years, and I had not had the opportunity to deploy. So when I then had my next job at Army Medical Command as the chief consultant and chief of clinical operations, fairly senior in the overall scheme of things, one of my jobs was to be responsible to identify augmentees for deployment. And I knew that for me to continue to fulfill my role and for me to continue to be a leader in Army medicine, I had to deploy and I had to go and experience what it was like to be in a combat zone, what it was like to be a leader in that environment. So I took it upon myself to kind of search for one of those augmentee positions and then put my own name on the line with about 10 stars worth of approval along the way to be able to go to Iraq as the chief of clinical operations and deputy surgeon for multinational Corps Iraq. And it was the experiences that I had already along the way that enabled me to be successful in that kind of position there in Iraq. What then happens, and one of the things that I think is relatively unique in my career that I still look on today as being an example of maybe what we should do more of, both in the military as well as in the VA where I am now, is that I went back and forth 3 different times between command positions at the brigade level and staff positions at the 3-star level. By doing that, you have the opportunity to, one, bring the experiences that you had from the command or the field up to headquarters to make sure that the policies and decisions that are made at headquarters can be executable at the field level. And then you learn how to get stuff done at headquarters that you can bring back to the field commands to make that a better environment to succeed for your hospitals. And I think based on some other events that happened over the course of my career, that combination of command and staff and the multiple types of experiences that I had enabled me to be successful at the next assignment or the next assignment, or even now, what I've been doing in the VA since I retired from the Army in 2016.
One of the many interesting things from your bio and CV that caught my attention was that you were involved with the first human Ebola vaccine trial. What kind of challenges did you face, and what did you learn about adapting medical research and crisis situations? And looking forward, we saw COVID after that. How can military medicine better be prepared for a rapid response in emerging health threats?
One of the things that we learned during that time, so in 2013, I became the commander of Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and that was after being the commander of the hospital at Fort Knox, the commander of the hospital at Fort Hood. I had to learn a whole new nomenclature and a whole new set of paradigms for funding and the research and acquisition rules associated with what we did in medicine versus what we did in the Army. What was interesting about that time and about the Ebola outbreak in 2014 is that we had this infrastructure at RARE where we tested and developed vaccines with clinical trials already set up with a big infrastructure to do that actually around the world, so that when there became a need to not only assist across the country for treatments and preparation in the event that we started to have an outbreak here from travelers from Africa, Liberia, etc., we had the infrastructure with the potential to pivot from clinical trials that we were doing for malaria medications or for dengue or for other infectious diseases to be able to then work internationally, because we had a Canadian company through DARPA that we were working with for vaccine development, and actually put together the first in human trials for that Ebola vaccine. And those trials were safety trials at that particular time. And in 2019, as it turned out, it finally got approval for the first Ebola vaccine, over the time period. But what we had to do was take the resources that we had and pivot to a different event, to a different set of requirements, to execute this new mission that became a national priority. And I think when you talk about kind of crisis leadership or crisis management, one of the things that becomes very important is to identify the mission requirements that you have today, match it up with the personnel that you have under your command, under your supervision, under your operation, and make that determination that the priorities have changed, and you have to take those folks and repurpose what you're doing in that mission, and to bring those people along and make sure there's an understanding of the need for that change, what the problem is you're trying to solve, and how important they are to be able to take advantage of that opportunity and start to make a difference. In this case, other things came out of that effort. We identified the need for vaccine development across the entire military complex, which included vaccines that would not be able to be manufactured in the private sector because there wasn't necessarily a need for that vaccine across the whole United States, but there was a need to protect our soldiers. So with the money that was potentially to be used for Ebola and for that crisis, when there was leftover money, we could take that and pivot into building a vaccine infrastructure, say for adenovirus, that might be important to protect the soldiers in the barracks from getting a lot of infections that stopped the training or stopped the mission requirements in barracks related units. So we can take the information learned from these crisis scenarios, which often have opportunities associated with it for money and resources to try to solve a problem, to then take those lessons and utilize them for advances down the road after the fact. And very often there's a long history of advances coming out of wartime. And in our case, in my specialty, one of those advances is advances in prosthetics, because of unfortunately all of the opportunities to utilize those services with the Iraq War and the IEDs and everything else that came out of that. So back to your original question, how does that help with preparedness? I think that it helps us identify each time one of these events occurred, what are the lessons learned that we don't want to repeat? I hearken back to the start of actually our post 9/11 wars when we first started in Afghanistan. And General Peake was our Surgeon General at the time. I was the PM&R consultant at the time. And one of the visions that he had was to identify ahead of time, how are we going to take care of an increased number of amputees in the service because of, at that point, worries about landmines and other things. So we, in conjunction with our orthopedic colleagues and our PT colleagues, researched the kind of care and battlefield medicine associated with amputations from Vietnam, because that was really the last time that we had a lot of that, and didn't want to have to relearn all of the lessons from then. Of course, we had to modernize that, But that allowed us to put plans in place for the potential to have a lot of soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen coming back from the war suffering from amputations. Now, that didn't happen very much in Afghanistan, but that preparation paid off for us and for the care of veterans as we got into Iraq and then had all the experiences with IEDs and the amputations caused by that. And the other thing that happened was because of the advances in battlefield medicine, many people survived blast injuries and other types of traumatic experiences that they didn't survive in Vietnam. And that left us with soldiers who had multiple limb amputations, perineal injuries, other sorts of things. So another challenge for, in our case, Army medicine, to figure out how to take care of those soldiers that would not have even survived 30 years ago or 50 years ago in Vietnam. So every time you have one of these situations where there's a crisis, a change, a need to evolve, then we've been there to do that, take advantage of it, and have lessons learned along the way.
So I want to move into another very challenging leadership situation that you were put in. You mentioned that you were commander at Fort Knox and then commander at the hospital at Fort Hood. Well, you were there. You had just gotten to Fort Hood around 2009, and that was a time when there was a mass shooting on the post. Can you walk us through your immediate actions and your thought process when you first learned about the shooting? And what did you do initially to mobilize the medical response team and deal with that tragedy?
Yeah, so I started as the commander of Carl R. Darnall Army Medical Center, the hospital at Fort Hood in July of 2009. And I specifically remember around Halloween, or Halloween in October, thinking that things were going relatively smoothly. On Thursday, November 5th, 2009, I was at a meeting with the 3 Corps Chief of Staff in their building, probably about a mile away from the hospital. And the Deputy Chief of Staff walked in and said, "Hey, we just had reports of shots fired near the Soldier Readiness Processing Center." And of course, the first thing you think about is, oh no. So we canceled and stopped that meeting, went back over to the hospital, and the situation started to develop and identify that we had this big mass casualty event with what ended up being 13 people killed, 31 or 2 injured. And what happens as a leader actually in that initial scenario is that you almost have to just stand back and let people do what they do. And you monitor the situation, you make sure that there are resources in the right place. We were very fortunate in that we had an emergency medicine residency on the site, and they were doing their didactic presentations there that day. Our surgeons were, on site. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and all of the protocols that you hear about triage and everything else sort of went out the window because all of the medics and all of the teams that were there were trauma and battle trained from the war, and from their perspective they were just going to take care of everybody that came to the center. Even though we were not an emergency level 1 trauma center, we still ended up taking care of 20 trauma patients, and probably about 8 or 9 ended up going to trauma centers around the city in Central Texas. So the first thing, though, is to let folks do what they're trained to do. And it's really hard to sit there and do that. But otherwise, you're just getting in the way. Now, what I vividly remember was a couple hours later, walking through the emergency room, and then the wards with the staff where some of the injuries were starting to get admitted, with General Cohn, Lieutenant General Cohn, who was the 3-star Corps commander at the time, and or 3 Corps commander at the time. he said, "Steve, you have a good operation here." And then I asked if there was an update, and he said, "Yes, we believe that the soldier was some psychiatrist named Malik Hassan Nadal. I'm sorry, Malik Nadal Hassan. He said it wrong. It was Hassan Malik Nadal. But that's in my brain forever because that turned an oh no moment into something completely different. Because number one, it's now one of my psychiatrists, in my command, who was the perpetrator to this terrible deed. And not only did we have to deal with the trauma of the event itself, the soldiers who were wounded, the staff, which happened to be mostly reservists and National Guard folks on the medical side who were under my command operating the Soldier Readiness Processing Unit, and then concentric circles out from the types of exposures that people would have to this traumatic event. We also had a situation where we were potentially dealing with the loss of trust in our mental health community in the Army because it was an Army psychiatrist who did this. So, a whole myriad of problems. What you then do is kind of what I was talking about earlier, lean on the various experiences that you've had before. And I had been a hospital commander before, so I knew how mass casualty evaluations and situations worked. I knew what my staff was capable of doing. I had been a deputy commander for clinical services, so I knew what the requirements were for medical education and for credentialing as questions came up about this particular psychiatrist and what he did or didn't do and what he did or didn't know and what we knew from his behaviors. I had been a staff officer and surgeon for a 3-star command on 2 different occasions. So I knew how that higher headquarters would work, and because there was a lot of reporting and a lot of help and a lot of coordination through all of these 3-star commands and others along the way. So you put all of that together and you take advantage of how you can find resources, how you can seek help, how you can get your staff to work together in this emergency environment to identify what's going on, make the decisions for the resources that are needed, identify what partnerships are going to be required in order to get the immediate care done, which is taking care of the soldiers, the wounded, your staff, communicating to your staff across the entire installation what's going on. If there was any mistake that we made in that initial event, it was not communicating thoroughly and transparently across the entire spectrum of the command at Fort Hood. We were focused primarily on the events right then and there that were happening at the hospital or at the soldier readiness processing. The other thing, and if I always look and see where I feel like we failed or could have done a better job, was really concentrating on the staff that were exposed to this event and when they would be ready to return to work, because we made the mistake of potentially trying to get back and, hey, let's complete the mission. We've got to continue to deploy. We've got to continue to get our soldiers ready to go. And our staff just wasn't ready to do that right away. And we had to learn that. We had to figure out that this effort to be the soldier and, pardon the expression, but to man up, for the next, set of duties and not listen to ourselves and not remember that we're humans ourselves, was a lesson that I'll never forget from that experience. And then as a physician, we're taught to be autonomous and make all these decisions ourselves, and it's really hard to realize that you can't do it all and that you have to ask for help. And that was another lesson to be learned during leadership.
Yeah, I mean, just one of the things that was just especially tough, I'm sure, was finding out that it's one of your own, it's one of your own teammates that is doing the shooting, and that, he was targeting folks in uniform. And so when you're dealing with the behavioral health ramifications of that, what did you find was the most helpful, and what really didn't work?
So I go back to the asking for help part. And one of the things that we needed to do was to put a plan together to deal with the myriad of behavioral health challenges that were going to come out of this event. And in the community itself, Fort Hood, Colleen, and the surrounding cities had a mass casualty event from a shooting at the Luby's cafeteria like 10 or so years before. So this was kind of another traumatic event that happened. And that's what I was talking about, the concentric circles of behavioral health challenges, because you had the people that were there, the people that knew the victims, the people in the community that had this challenge before. And one of the lessons through all this was that we had to get expertise to come in and help us build a behavioral health plan to tackle all of these disparate groups and all who had different challenges. Trauma event management was a term that we actually used psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers from some of our reserve components to come in and set up locations for behavioral health care of those that were in those first two kind of concentric circles of immediate and secondary impact from a psychological standpoint. We had then set up serial opportunities for what our primary Fort Hood staff would do. We took advantage of MedCom's ability to deploy and provide additional people and provide funding for additional mental health needs for our soldiers. Now, remember, this is right in the middle of the second surge in Iraq, and Fort Hood was one of the most deployed units in general. About 25,000 soldiers were also in the process of now returning from that 3 Corps deployment, that had happened before as well. So we had a massive need for behavioral health, not only for the soldiers that had been involved in the trauma itself, but those that were coming back, after the fact. So a lot of effort there. The other thing that I learned that I think was very important, and something that General Cohn did that really was beneficial, was to bring in community members, in some cases, who had a negative viewpoint of the Army and a negative viewpoint of Fort Hood and the events that had occurred, and making them part of an advisory group to help tell us what to do and how to take care of folks, and how we partnered with the private sector medical support people in the community as well, in order to take care of folks, because we couldn't do it all ourselves.
So after retiring from the military, what drove your journey from being a leader within the military health system to then joining the Veterans Health Administration? And did you feel like your experience on active duty prepared you well enough, or was this a completely different animal?
So when it was time to retire, I looked back at my career and say, hey, what did I like doing the most? And it was an easy answer for me. It was my times as a hospital commander, and being able to use the kind of combination of leadership and administrative skills I had, but always with a clinical soul of what we were trying to do. The VA at the time was just coming out of the scandal that they had with their access scandals associated with the Phoenix VA and the Heinz Chicago VA, and a few other places. And there were 30 to 35 openings for medical center directors. And I decided that, that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a hospital CEO somewhere. And as I was going through the evaluation process of what to do next, I figured that my skill set for federal medicine was probably a lot more marketable than skill set to go into private sector medicine where dollars are the bottom line. I knew how federal medicine worked. I knew where the money came from. I knew how to utilize resources, and most importantly, the mission to take care of those who wore the cloth of our nation, myself included, is really important. And to be able to continue to take care of that mission while using the skills that I had to be a director of a hospital was really important, and just a joy to be able to get into. The VA is not like the Army, and entirely civilian personnel. Most people are dedicated to the mission, but there are a couple of differences between the military and the VA. People ask me that all the time. The biggest difference, I think, is that in the Army, whenever an active duty soldier or a DA civilian would get promoted or go into a new job, there was always some kind of prerequisite training course that was required that had a little piece of leader development in it. And whether in the Army, if you were an officer, whether that was going from basic training to officer advanced course to command and general staff and other sorts of things, or it was a ward master course or just about anything, we got training associated with that. In the VA, very often people get promoted based on their technical skills and how well they do their job, and not associated with their leader development and their um, readiness for management and supervisory responsibility. And so sometimes that makes it a little more challenging to deal with conflict. That's a challenge that we have sometimes in the VA, where you have basic, workplace conflict that folks deal with it like parents instead of deal with it like, really good managers that can hold things together. And, learning the culture of how to deal with civilian protections, but also how to deal with leadership from the standpoint of building teams where nothing's mandatory, or there's this notion that in the military you can just order people to do something and that's going to make everything successful. Of course, good leaders know you still have to build those teams, and you still have to practice, and you still have to engage in people's interests, and keep a good command climate and build morale and keep people motivated for the things that you do. That becomes just as important in a civilian enterprise like the VA, still working for the government and still working for really good, honorable people who are there to serve the mission. So figuring out a different culture is always a challenge, and that's true no matter what new kind of experience you get in. But leading people is leading people, and that's been the fun part. And then if you have a bad day, you walk down to the lobby and you walk down to the clinics and you talk to the veterans and you talk to the staff, and all of a sudden you have a good day, because you're there to help folks. And that's one of the things I love about did love about the job that I continue to have now, because I'm almost entirely administrative outside of the hospital setting and now at headquarters again. I don't necessarily get to walk down and talk to veterans, but um, now that COVID's over and we have a requirement to return to work, there's a lot more people at work, and we get to have camaraderie again in the office, and that's a good thing.
You mentioned COVID, and COVID was a thing that kind of really highlighted how federal health needed to work together, especially in the United States. And one of the things that is kind of a hot topic now is large scale combat operations. And we haven't had that, since World War II. Fighting a near peer, we could find ourselves in the continental United States having to take care of a lot of wounded patients, where military health system and the VA health system and the civilian health system would all have to work together. How do you view the status and the role of the partnerships between VA and private sector health and the military health system, and what successes are currently going on, and what needs to be improved, do you think?
So one of the things that I'm now involved in that in this chief operating officer role that I hadn't been involved in before is a couple of sets of committees called the JEC and the HEC. And the JEC stands for the Joint Executive Committee, and the HEC stands for the Healthcare Executive Committee. And these are joint committees between the Army and DoD, I'm sorry, the VA and DoD, to work together for just what you described. How can we share resources, whether those are installation and infrastructure resources, or have rotations for residency programs and nurse training programs between the VA and DoD sites, be able to have training sites for medics that are out dispersed across the country, maybe in reserve units, who then can do medical training at the VA hospitals. How do we share medical resources in times of need? What are our evacuation plans when those are needed? So COVID was a good example also of not just the military and VA working together, where there were several instances where we did that, but also the VA and the community working together. So the VA has 4 missions, and the first 3 are pretty widely known, and that's the healthcare, the academics for teaching. Probably 80 to 90% of all physicians have done at least one rotation, either in medical school or residency in a VA hospital. And then research, where research is widely known, lots of advances that happened from the VA. But the 4th mission isn't as widely known, and that is helping the United States in times of emergency. And COVID is a great example where we had teams that went out to private sector nursing homes during the height of COVID, when nursing homes didn't have the resources to be able to provide appropriate care, isolation, PPE, etc., for often the veterans that we had in contract nursing homes, but often just regular civilians who were unaffiliated with the veterans. We had space in some inpatient wards where, when there was a particularly hard hit community with COVID, we would accept their patients in our hospitals to be able to care for them. When their vaccines were initially coming out, we got vaccine supply through the VA and the federal government, in some cases faster than some of the private sector hospitals, and we could assist with vaccine use and development. Those same processes and resources are available should we have one of these conflicts, where the ability to care for the wounded or care for civilians who might be injured, God forbid this comes to our land. Work that we did over the last few years with COVID to be able to do the same thing as that 4th mission, national defense mission that we have to take care of the overflow, I guess, if you will, in the U.S. One of the things that we're doing now is taking military medical installations that are no longer in use, clinics where they've kind of drawn down, and turning them over to the VA to use as VA clinics. Pensacola is the most recent one, where we now have a hospital clinic in Pensacola from the naval base there. There are other similar kinds of examples, another one in North Carolina. So that's an advantage of a partnership that's very beneficial between the two.
One of the historical challenges that the DoD and the VA have had is that kind of that continuity of care as you leave active duty or leave the DoD system and move into veteran care. What specific initiatives or programs do you see as beneficial for VA and DoD collaboration to improve that continuity of care and having the systems talk to each other better and share information and care for that patient as a holistic patient that's not caught between one system and another, but is kind of comforted that they're in both and they both understand who they are?
Yeah. So that's one of the initiatives that's going to come out of the JEC that I was talking about before, was a real focus on getting soldiers into a VA within the first 90 days post transition. And in many cases, the goal will be to have that first appointment, if they know where they will be, given to them on the way out of the service. And I think for those of us in the service, we know that there's a lot of inconsistency in the transition programs that are available to folks as they leave. But that's a goal, is to not only be able to have veterans or future veterans start their disability evaluation process upon the last couple of months while they're still in the service, to then get connected to the neighborhood VA to where they're going to go afterwards. That's a very vulnerable time. And even if we don't get the primary care piece part of that going right away, we want to make sure folks leave with knowing how to contact mental health services as they depart their military career. So that's something that we'll be working on. There are a couple of uh, pilot projects occurring out of one of our New England sites, where there actually are community sponsors who are veterans themselves, usually, who will almost like sponsor a transitioning military member as they come into the community, and start to help them see their way through the VA bureaucracy in some cases, and we want to try to decrease that bureaucracy and make it easy to get in. Since I joined the VA in 2016, I've exclusively gotten my medical care through the VA system. I'm eligible for TRICARE. I have the federal health insurance, so my wife has an easier time getting her care. TRICARE isn't always as available as we would like it to be. But the care that I've gotten in the VA has been superb. In the beginning, when I would go to, I've now been in two hospitals as the director in Chicago and in Los Angeles, and then eventually moved up to headquarters. But the first few months, I could be a secret shopper. As I start to get care, eventually that goes away. But the care really is superb, and it would be disingenuous of me to say that we've got this great system and then I have to go somewhere else for my medical care. But between the various procedures that I've had along the way, I can't be prouder of the work that everybody does in our system.
Yeah, and I can back that up completely. I mean, I retired here in San Antonio, which has a plethora of active duty DoD resources, and I pretty much get 100% of my care from the VA, and it's been great. So kudos to what you guys are doing and continue to do. One of the things that you mentioned was, there are some things unique to the military system, that you see more in that population. You talked about prosthetics, things like traumatic brain injury, PTSD. How do we get the VA and DoD working better together to do groundbreaking research to really make a difference in those things?
I think one of the changes that we'll be making to VA research down the road is really focusing on those veteran-centric kinds of needs that we have. Very often, and we saw this in the Army too, especially at the academic medical centers and where there's a lot of research associated with the residency programs and such, that some research is done based on the interests of the researcher. The important thing, though, is especially as we get into times like we have now, where there may be fewer resources available to us to do research, to provide medical care, et cetera, in this environment where versus when cash was flowing during COVID, that we have to focus those research efforts on the things that are needed for the veterans and for support of the military versus the projects that are of interest to people. And that's where the NIHs and the academic institutions come in for the other levels of research. So whether that is on mental health disorders, whether that is on rehabilitation, whether it's on traumatic brain injury and spinal cord injury, amputations and prosthetics, the things that will make a difference for the veterans, we want to continue to do that. The advantage that the VA has in research, and where it will continue to partner with DoD to the extent that it can, is that it's the country's largest single healthcare system. And the data that we can get from the care that we're providing to veterans across the country can change the way we look at medicine. And even if it's not specific to a veteran centric issue, it might be specific to a national need. So, long COVID is a great example. Because of the research capacity that we had when COVID hit, just like I talked about pivoting Ebola vaccine work at Rare, we were able to pivot a lot of our research to research into COVID, into vaccinations, into the antivirals, into the impact of COVID on people's general health. And some of the best research on long COVID is coming out of St. Louis and the VA out there. So similarly, when there's a need to identify things that are going to be beneficial for probably not battlefield medicine, but for the after effects of a wartime environment, the after effects of long careers, the impact of what our military members do. Those are great opportunities to work together between our military research institutions and our VA researchers.
One of the things I hear a lot nowadays from folks that are working in the DoD systems is, I call it an access to care problem, and it's not like you would normally think about it. It's access for healthcare professionals to challenging cases and complex cases, because the active duty population is fairly healthy, and sometimes you just don't have the ability to take care of the complex cases, surgeries, medical conditions that are a lot more prevalent in the VA system. How can the VA and DoD work together to maybe help the readiness of the professionals within that are wearing the uniform, who have to go over in austere locations and take care of tough stuff, to have those challenging cases back here at home to help keep them current?
I think I would say, Doug, is that there are multiple locations across the VA where we have VA hospitals and clinics co-located with military medical installations, where we do just that, where we take the military medical staff and they see some of our VA patients. We have VA providers that utilize the military installations in order to expand the footprint for care. And those are win-win opportunities the more often that we can do that for that readiness piece for our military. Now, in some cases, we have the same problem in VA hospitals where we have these hospitals that have been set up for a long time, but their um, average daily census on the inpatient side is very low, or the number of patients that they might have for cardiac procedures is very low. And then we have to make the decision, do we continue to provide that care and capability in our clinics and hospitals in a particular location, or is that the kind of thing that we refer to the community for community care? And I think the important piece is that study after study shows that the quality of care that we provide in the VA is at or above the metrics associated in general with the community. But the community is our partner in the care for our veterans. And we can't take care of everybody without that partnership. And that includes VA DoD partnerships and includes partnerships with community providers to be able to see our veterans when that's the right place and the right specialty for that care to be provided for them.
So looking forward, what is your vision for the Veterans Health Administration in the next 5, 10 years, and what's your role in getting there?
So, as the chief operating officer, I'm probably one of the top 4 leaders in the VHA, the Veterans Health Administration, when it comes to primarily working on the operations of the field enterprise and how our hospitals, clinics, and personnel are managing the day-to-day requirements. But it's also part of the strategy quadrant, I guess, if you will, to assess how we're moving forward. And right now, I think it's easy to see what's in the newspapers and identify changes that are ongoing in the federal government where we have an opportunity to revision or re-envision what the VA will look like and be in an opportunity to be nimble in the provision of healthcare across the country. So the idea is to be able to partner with our community colleagues and provide efficient, productive, and beneficial, high quality care to the veterans with a focus on what the veteran needs versus what the institution of the VA needs. And whether that's reimagining what our higher headquarters looks like in terms of oversight, the network structure that we have, which facilities should stay open and continue to provide care versus what's high risk and is appropriately utilized from the standpoint of resources. We want to be able to take a look at all of that and make it so that we have the right resources in the right place to take care of the veterans that really wouldn't be well served in the community. And focusing on those things that really make veteran and military care so unique to what happens in the private sector, and that behavioral health care, that combination of primary care and behavioral health care together, that care for rehabilitation, spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, prosthetics, the now as we get into geriatrics, because the age of our veteran population, it's come down a bit, but still 40 to 50%, just under 50% are over 65. and that'll start rising again. Hopefully, if we don't have many more wars with our younger military members having to become eligible for VA care. So I think there's a good opportunity to uh, reshape and reconfigure what we're doing to prioritize what the veteran needs while still maintaining a training environment for the future providers across the country and focusing that research on what the veterans need versus what the researcher is most interested in.
So, for our younger listeners out there, what advice would you give to them, those who are considering a career in either military medicine or federal medicine?
Young providers looking at military medicine get the best of all worlds in regards to being able to do just about anything in the medical continuum of care. I remember a time where I had a commander who became a mentor of mine sat me down towards the end of my time at Walter Reed, and it's probably the reason it was the end of my time at Walter Reed, to basically say, Steve, what do you want to do moving forward? He said, what you don't want to do is look back after a 20 or whatever year career and say, I wish I would have, because you can. And the beauty of Army medicine is, once you get your degree, once you get if you're a physician, your residency, you can be whatever it is you want to try to be. And if it doesn't work out, you go and do something else. If you want to be an academician, if you want to be a clinician for, just basically putting on your white coat and seeing patients and soldiers and stuff, if you want to be an operations provider and be out in the field, if you want to get into administration, you can work to do all those. And if it doesn't work out, you can go back and, do some of the other stuff. I had an opportunity to get leadership positions at a much younger, age, so to speak, than I would have in the private sector, especially when I was moving up in the residency world. And, there weren't many residency directors across the country at 36 to 40 years old. So you can do it all, and a little bit at a time, but you have the opportunity to do all of that kind of stuff. And I have absolutely no regrets. I also like the fact that because I had a scholarship for medical school, I didn't have any debt. You're coming out of residency, although that was until I got married, and then I had to take a little loan. But that's Susan doesn't like it when I say that 38 years later.
So when the history books are written 50, 100 years from now, how would you like your legacy in military and federal medicine to be recorded?
I think I would hope that people would say that I was a good, effective leader. Because of some of the experiences that I've had, I'm probably as or more comfortable in a VUCA environment, that volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment, where a little bit of that right now, as there's so many changes going on, and being able to have that calming leadership influence to keep the group together, to focus on the mission at hand. And I've been fortunate throughout my career to work for organizations where there's no more noble mission than what we do, taking care of America's finest as, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and now the Guardians from the Space Command.
Well, we've been speaking with Dr. Stephen Braverman on WarDocs podcast. Steve, thanks again for sharing your experiences and insights with us, and thank you for your service to this nation. It was good to talk to you.
Thank you. It was good to see you again, Doug.
Thank you for listening to WarDocs. We sure hope you enjoyed it. WarDocs is a nonprofit organization supported by donations from listeners like you. Please follow and subscribe to our show on whatever platform you consume your podcasts. and rate and review this episode, and share the show with your contacts on social media. Find out more information about our show, our guests, and how to become a member of Team WarDocs on WarDocsPodcast.com. Thank you for your support. If you like war stories and medical drama, WarDocs has you covered. Spread the word.